So I'm John Foreman. I was formerly the British Defence Attaché in Moscow between 2019 and 2022, including the period of the invasion. I previously served in Kiev in Ukraine between 2008 and 2011. Yes, but I think it's important to say we had Ben Wallace and Tony Radakin, Chief of Defence Staff, coming to Moscow. The last time we'd done that was in 1944 when Churchill and Allenbrook came to Moscow. So it was like a big moment. And, Ben Wallace wanted to come to talk to Shoigu and Gerasimov because we knew that they were talking to Putin because it was part of the preparation. And Shoigu repeated the normal lies. There's a genocide going on of Russians in Donbass at the hands of the Ukrainians, that Ukraine is going to become a bridgehead towards NATO to attack Russia, that Ukraine is basically Russian. Ben Wallace is very good at pushing back at that sort of stuff and trying to get back to bilateral discussions rather than sort of fantasy histories. But Gerasimov said, we have no plans to attack Ukraine. And then Tony Radakin said, well, if that's the case, why do you have 250,000 soldiers on the border? And he didn't answer that question at all. So we got back to the embassy and somebody said, well, they're either lying to our faces or they don't mean it. They're not going to attack. The assumption was, the conclusion was they were lying, that what we'd seen was the attempt just to snowball us along and just to sort of kid us and not get ready. So the proof was that Ben Wallace went back and ordered more weapons to go, defensive weapons to go to Ukraine. And that's what happened. So I think we saw them lying. We saw the sort of narrative they were telling themselves, the sort of emotion, the way they were speaking to us, and then we realised that this was pretty bad and we had to get ready for it. Unfortunately, our colleagues in France and Germany and Italy didn't always trust us, and even the Ukrainians were still at that stage, I think, saying it's not going to happen. And we were saying, look, we literally met these people, they mean it. We said at the time, I wrote at the time, Russia had lost strategic surprise because it's self-telegraphed. We had the first build-up in the spring 21. We've seen all these tanks pile up. We looked into their eyes, and they lied to us, to our faces, about what their intention was. But even at the end, there was still the doubt in some minds that was this a gigantic bluff to force the West into concessions, or was it all preparation for invasion? I was very much into, well, you've got a massive army on the border of Ukraine, something's going to happen soon. Others were sort of saying, no, this is just to get us to make concessions to them about NATO and enlargement, and stationing forces in the east and nuclear weapons and all that sort of stuff. It turned out I was right and others were wrong. That evening was Defenders of the Fatherland Day, is February the 23rd. They had this massive fireworks display. My wife wasn't with me. I sent her back to the UK just in case, things got leery. And I'm sitting on the balcony, drinking whiskey, having a smoke, watching all this going on, thinking, well, what's coming? Because there's this thundery sound rolling around the river where we lived in the embassy. And I thought at the time, nothing's going to be the same again if it happens. And sure enough, it wasn't, so that sort of 23rd into 24th, we all wake up in the morning of the 24th, and there's Putin on I'm watching it on my phone, watching him announce his special military operation. But I think a lot of Russians didn't expect it either. They always hoped above hope that it wasn't going to happen, including people we thought were very close to the no. And it turned out that I think the decision to do was Putin and his small cabal around him, this sort of informal play people, including his ex-judo partners, that the system was unprepared for it, which I think led to the sort of series of disasters we saw in February, March 22. Well, I think firstly he's been obsessed with Ukraine since the early days of his misrule. If you read some Russian writers, he was totally railing against Ukrainian being uppity for daring to be independent. They're part of this sort of holy trinity of the Slavic nations between the Russians, the Ukrainians, the Belarusians. And then I think over his time, he became more and more focused on restoring what he sees as Russian lands. So you see this conversation about the Russian world, that Russians living abroad, we must step up and defend them. The narrative that I think Ukrainians aren't really Ukrainians, independent people. They're just a branch of the Russian people who speak a funny language, a funny dialect. So I think there's a lot of chauvinism towards Ukraine. But I think if you look to me, if I say, why do you do it? I think one, he did it was to absorb Ukraine and Ukrainian statehood and nationhood, both, geographically, politically, and also Ukrainians as independent people. and bring him back into the fold. I think he did it too as part of his agenda that Russia is a great power, that without Ukraine, Russia can't be a great power. I think thirdly, it was to push back at the 1991 settlement, which him and the Siloviki were railing against, that Russia lost the Cold War and been defeated and want to push back against that defeat. And also I think it was part of his sort of vision of Russia as an independent source of power, as a great power on the world stage, alongside China and America, dividing the world up into zones in which they can do what they want to do. And I think the last point is like his legacy. He wants to be seen as a great historic figure. So it's personal to him. It's not just about geopolitics. It's about ethnicity. It's about hurt. It's about loss. It's about anger. And I think all those things together came. That's why he did it. And I think he saw Joe Biden as a weak touch, to be honest. It came in the wake of the evacuation from Afghanistan. He'd done a build-up in 2021 where Biden responded by offering a summit. I think he probably Putin looked at Biden and think, you're weak. I can get away with it. It's part of that opportunism, which he's done before. Fortunately, he chose badly, I think, Putin, because NATO did stand together. America did stand with Ukraine. Ukraine has fought for their own independence, and we are where we are after 4 years. Well, I think it's very difficult. I think he lived on the wrong side of Leningrad as well, St. Petersburg. I think he grew up in the 1950s in the wake of the war, which obviously caused significant suffering in the city during the Great Siege. I think one thing that always struck me is when I went to St. Petersburg and laid a wreath at one of the war cemeteries there. We just followed after Putin, and he laid a wreath where his brother was buried, who died of starvation during the siege. And I think, also the personal side, he makes a point of that every year to go to that cemetery to lay a wreath. So I think that probably the death of his older brother, sort of loomed over him to say he was growing up, and also he lost another brother before that, of diphtheria in the 1930s. So combination of loss of children, loss of his uncles, his mother survived the siege, his father being wounded. I think it was all extremely difficult. I think that sort of sets the scene for his upbringing in the 50s and 60s. He said that he was bullied. I'm a small kid in a tough neighbourhood, living in communal housing as only child. I don't want to get into the COD psychology part, but I don't think his childhood was easy. And I think he was looking for something, a way out of that poverty, as any kid would do. He was looking for structure and order in his life, perhaps with a slightly chaotic family life and living in this rather tough neighbourhood. And I think that's probably why he pointed him towards, in particular, the KGB as a exemplar of the new Soviet state of order, of prestige. And he's spoken about how he wanted to join the KGB from an early time. They sent him away to university to come back and to get a degree. He chose law because they gave him more chance of getting the KGB. So like me, I set my sights on the Navy early. He set his sights on the KGB too. Was it an escape? I think it gave two options. One was a career, but I think you remember growing up in the 50s and 60s, in the 60s in particular under Brezhnev. There's a high point of the Soviet space program, the Soviet nuclear program, that Russia was a great power, had sort of moved beyond the trials and tribulations of the war and Stalin, that the future was bright. And the KGB was the Praetorian Guard of the regime. They were meant to be, at least on paper, incorruptible, the guardians of the state. Their emblem is a sword and a shield. The sword to smite their enemies, the shield to protect the Russian people. So I think there's a slight glamour in that as well. And I think certainly he saw the KGB not just as a job, but as a way of life. I think everybody's aware of the story about the rat. I think it's been overblown, to be honest. I think I was reading about it on the way here, and how it's a throwaway line of 100 words or something in one of his books or his interviews. But it's been dressed up by people to say this gives a clear indication into his mindset. He identifies the rat, for example. And you see all these experts to say, don't threaten Putin, he'll act like a cornered rat, he'll strike back. And it's that narrative that don't tread on us and we'll fight back. But the other way to look at it is actually he identifies as the little boy who ran away from the rat. He didn't stand up to the rat. He actually backed down. So I think we should be careful of taking, something he may have just thrown away and to read into his psychology, that he's this little tough character will force fight back. And I think actually what's interesting is over the last few years, when we've actually stood up to Putin and said this is not acceptable, whether it's on NATO membership of Finland and Sweden, or whether it's Army Ukraine or providing the missiles, he hasn't actually then bitten back like that fictional rat. Putin's nurture in Leningrad and then St. Petersburg as a young man in the KGB in East Germany is foundational for how he behaves now. But I don't think he's he's an island. People talk about, is it Putin's Russia or Russia's Putin? I think there's a lot of traditional Russian thought in him of how he regards the West, which he has no experience of, how he looks at Russia's history as a sort of anchor. I think he's a Russian nationalist. I think the nationalism has grown over his time in power. He's much more free to express it. I think he's also a product of the Soviet upbringing as well. And I think the people he surrounds himself with all tend to be of that same generation. Born in the 50s, grew up in the 60s and 70s, experienced the end of communism, the collapse of the Soviet Union, which really rankles with them, which they want to redress by, quote, making Russia great again. Well, I don't think he was a great figure in the KGB. I think one of the resident in the Residentura, who was the KGB chief in old East Germany, didn't know him. So he was a functionary, I think, in a minor town. I think also his focus was on internal dissidence, counter-espionage. It wasn't on, quote, spycraft. Last week, the old Russian defense minister, Sergei Ivanov, died, and he was posted abroad. The best spies in the KGB were posted abroad, and those who weren't were kept back. Putin had this sort of image of the KGB, of espionage, of the Cambridge Five, of doing work in amongst the capitalist enemy. Ultimately, was a rural, also a minor outpost inside East Germany, spying on East Germans. He, and his biographers, like to talk up his sort of KGB bona fides, but actually it was a huge, huge organisation, which he was one small cog. I think the Judoka analogy is probably better than the multi-dimensional chess player, that Putin is this sort of grand strategic genius who's always thinking 5 moves ahead of us and has got us off balance, and there's an evil mastermind stroking his cat in his lair. I think the judo thing does work well about using the enemy's strength against it. I think Putin is fundamentally quite a defensive and reactive character who sees opportunity and seizes them rather than has any great plan going forward. So the idea of the judo is also about personal discipline in terms of your physical fitness, the way of life. It's not just about judo in the ring. I think judo sportsmen and women talk about it as a way throughout your life how to behave. So again, maybe it gave a code of conduct to a boy growing up who needed some sort of rigor. I think what's interesting also is that how he's kept in touch with his judo partners from his childhood all the way through his life. So something obviously resonated with him about judo in that period. I think he's actually continued his fascination with judo through his life, and I think it's why bans on Russian sportsmen and women really rankles with him, because he sees that as part of his narrative that Russia is a great sporting power. I think we've lost. I think he's moved away from his riding a bear horse, wrestling a bear type of thing as he's got older. There comes a sort of a certain time for any man, including myself included, that riding around bare-shirted is probably not advisable as you get paunchier. But it is the image of a strong leader, father of the nation, father of the people, a historical figure. I think Lavrov said, he judges himself against Ivan the Great, Catherine the Great, and Peter the Great. He sees himself as a historic figure. That's why when you see him, whether it's on the Victory Day parade or whether he's doing his interminable 5-hour telephone discussions, it's quite resonant of how Russian leaders throughout the ages have dealt with themselves, that they are above politics. They are the good Tsar who can be appealed to and to sort things out. So I think he's modelled himself on that and moved away from, so we say, politics. Politics is beneath him. He's been elevated up. I think there is a degree of cult personality which has grown in the last few years. That he's infallible, that he's all-seeing and omnipotent. That he's the man who stands up against the filthy Westerners and the British. That he knows everything, but I think it's just a joke. I remember when I lived in Moscow You see these great set-piece events set up with cameras like here. He briefly comes on, doesn't really engage anybody. It's just basically sending a message, because it's about getting the message out to people across the biggest country in the world to promulgate that image. Well, there's a massive plot. I think conspiracy theories are great and they sell books. Putin's a sort of Blofeldian mastermind. He's a representative of a secret cult. They sit around in KGB towers and in hoods, and they all plot the future of Russia for hundreds of years. I think that's rubbish. I think, as I said, there's many times along the way that Putin had just been a sort of functionary in St. Petersburg. He rode his chance to power and grabbed it and consolidated it. I don't think he was part of some cunning plan. The plan's so cunning, you could put a tail on it, call it a fox. I think it was, do I think the KGB, people who served the KGB were gutted by the end of the Soviet Union and the loss of the diminution of their power, influence? Yes. Do I think they want to get back into power? Yes. And did they? Yes. But did I think that there was sort of people there with plans? That's not how Russia works. Russia's much more chaotic than that, especially in the days since the end of the Soviet Union was in the 80s was particularly chaotic, especially with the war in Afghanistan going on. So, it sells books, and I see the stuff that Putin's behind Brexit, or Putin's behind, this secret plot, or Putin's behind Trump's rise to power. I think anybody who looks and understands Russia could barely look after his own interests, let alone do that. I think it's a country which exploits other people's problems. It's not a country that causes the problems in the first place. Well, I think Siloviki are a group of men who came from a similar security background in the KGB in the 70s in particular. So if you look at people like Patrushev, former deputy head or secretary of the National Security Council, Bortnikov, the head of the Federal Security Service now, plus people like Sechin, who was in it, and Narishkin, who's now the head of the Foreign Intelligence Service. They all came through that. And I think it's best to say I think it's not just the fact their upbringing is shared, it's their mindset is shared, that they look in the world in a very paranoid and skeptical, hard, realist way. And they see that all the way through to today. So those around Putin who are telling him to carry on fighting to win, quote unquote, in Ukraine, tend to come from that bloc. There's another bloc, which you might say are more non-Siloviki, more meritocratic, technocratic, who see a path for, which we say, more peaceful coexistence to the West. But these hardliners have inveigled their way into all sorts of positions of power. They're all getting it all together. When you saw the National Security Council just before the invasion, you could go around them, you can pick out a number of people there who are part of this sort of security bloc. They're also the ones who don't see on the stage. You've also got KGB backgrounds in all sorts of parts of state enterprise. And Siloviki are trying to get their children into positions of power after Putin goes. So it's a sort of self-generating bloc, which they hope that in due course will then continue to hold the reins of power in a future Russia. They're not the only bloc. I mean, there's obviously the criminal bloc, and there's also the armed forces. There's also, you might say, these sort of meritocrats. But not liberals, not doves by any means, but have seen the world slightly differently. But unfortunately, I think that the war has accelerated the control of Russia, have given more control into the hands of the Siloviki over the last 4 years. Having state enterprises, failing bureaucratic, inefficient state enterprises, as the UCOS example showed, in state hands doesn't work. If we put them into private hands, it can work. If we better management, bring in Western expertise and knowledge, and they were in the early stages in 1990s, 2000s of how to make things better, how we get more money, make a profit, and have a stock exchange and things like that. Normal market economy stuff. The downfall is how it was done and how it's privatized. So basically, you took money from one group, the Communist Party, and the enterprises, and you gave them to another. But the difference was that the people in the communist regime were motivated by ideology, and the ones in the private sector are motivated by greed. So I think what we've seen is, although Putin keeps trying to talk about more control, state control and bringing stuff back into the fold. It's been a disaster for the Russian people. Russia has enormous potential and wealth, but it's always managed to found itself themselves denied of that wealth, denied of that opportunity. The state has become the way to wealth now, not the private sector, and that's because of Putin and how he's consolidated handing favours out. I'd say when I visited the Soviet Union in 1979 for the first time as a 15-year-old schoolboy, the black market was endemic because the state couldn't provide for the needs of the people. So if you can't get food through the normal system, if you can't get opportunity for your children or opportunity to get a job or access to university, then you have to find other ways to do it. I know that there was always the formal state, the communist state, central planning, state supermarkets, free property, that sort of thing. And there's always a sort of very great shadow informal state as well. And I think, I know, for example, in Ukraine, they used to talk about that being up to a quarter or maybe a half of the economy. It was all in the shadows. So it's not as if it became, it was, I think, a reaction to this communist system, not to grew up organically from them without a reason. And then when Russia became, so the Soviet Union collapsed, Russia became the Russian Federation, those sort of networks were already in place. So a lot of what happened is that then the old state system was then privatized into the hands of people who already got advantage in the old system, in the old black market, which led to the sort of transfer of capital from the state into the private hands of the so-called oligarchs in the 1990s, which led in due course to alternative centers of power and the gradual breakdown of the Russian state. I mean, I think Boris Yeltsin's significance is that he chose Putin to be his successor. I think there was a number of different paths that could have been taken, which would have chosen a leader to a different successor. But for whatever reason, the family and the people around him, the oligarchs, chose Putin because they thought he was trustworthy, he wouldn't go after their money and their lives, and that he wouldn't change the system they put in place. And I think, as Navalny said, that was a mistake of epic proportions for those who went down that path. Once they let the KGB or FSB back into the cabbage patch, the goat ate all the cabbages and continued to consume the Russian state from within and undermined the whole state. In fact, undermined everything that Yeltsin sort of achieved in the 1990s. You know, the mad geopolitics and confrontation with the West, the clamping down on civil society, the ending of free elections, the ending of the media, free media, the driving of people into exile, the murder of political opponents, the imprisonment of people for liking posts on social media, and of course launching a war on Ukraine. So Yeltsin was, I went to his museum actually in Ekaterinburg, and if you believe what the spin is in the museum, he's this Abraham Lincoln type figure, a shining Democrat, a man who led Russia to the promised lands of democracy. But actually, if you look at his own record, Yeltsin's record in the 1990s, there was a brief period, I think, of democracy in the early 1990s, but by 93 he was changing the constitution, he was persecuting political opponents, he rigged an election in 96. So you saw this sort of optimism that Russia's turning the page to a new future, sort of retrenchment back into the old ways of doing things, the informal state, the nexus of crime and politics, the clamping down on civil society, and ultimately leading to Vladimir Putin once they'd chosen the person who should succeed him. Well, the family of the people of Yeltsin's immediate family, especially his daughter, son-in-laws, and the people associated with them who become rich on the back end of the 1980s and into the early 1990s. And I think they looked around for somebody who they could trust. In the same way as Putin's been looking around for someone he can trust and can't find somebody he can hand power over to. And Putin had come from Leningrad, St. Petersburg, been a sort of functionary apparatchik for Sobchak, Antonio Sobchak, the former mayor. And he'd come to Moscow to run, I think, the Moscow property department, which is a way of handing over state property into private hands, into the right private hands. He proved adept at that. He then was brought across into the sort of presidential administration. Then becomes, he rises. He's in the sort of National Security Council. Then he's into the FSB, working his way up. And all along, I think he was good at managing relationships with all the various competing blocs, whether it's criminality, security services, and the family, oligarchs. He was a hard worker. He did what he said he would do, and had a sort of image of, I suppose, efficiency. They looked at 4 or 5 different candidates before they got to him. Each one didn't pass the test of trust, I think. And then they happened on Putin. And they made the bet that he wouldn't go after them immediately, which he kept, to be honest. But in return, Yeltsin had to leave the stage when he handed over in 2000, and that was it. He couldn't sort of chirp from the sidelines. And anybody who did speak out against him, in particular Berezovsky, was driven into exile and then died in exile. Berezovsky thought he would be the puppet master of the whole thing. Very clever guy. He'd made a lot of money in that transitional period between communism and capitalism. He saw himself as sort of the great eminence behind the scenes, pulling all the strings, making sure that Yeltsin and his own personal interests would be protected. I think if you look at the book, The Wizard of the Kremlin, which I'd recommend people to read, it's quite interestingly how it describes how Boris Berezovsky made a bad bet, made bad calls. I don't think he really understood who he was up against. That the person, Putin, is ruthless and determined to consolidate his own power. And that the idea that he'd go along with this sort of fiction that he'd be at that behest of Berezovsky or the family was proven completely incorrect, that he had his own mind. I think the warning signs were when he went after Khodorkovsky in 2003, the Yukos oligarch. That sent a warning to everybody that the old system was not going to be tolerated and that oligarchs were over, as I think one of the Russians have said themselves, and that all power would come back to the state. And that it would be Putin would give out the money and prestige and access. It wouldn't be these independent states, sectors of power. That the strong state, which I think goes back to that sort of Soviet mentality of the vertical of power, regulated by the KGB or the FSB. And then Berezovsky had his TV, I think, interest taken away. He was then forced into exile, where he became a rather sad figure, always hoping to get the eye of Putin again, pleading to go back and begging for forgiveness, but he died in exile. But some people say he was murdered, other people just died of a broken heart. Power drives Putin, and power begets great wealth as well. It's not about, he didn't get power to make himself wealthy. He got power to be a great Russian figure, to rebuild Russia as you saw it, which also gives him access to great wealth. And the way the system works is that there's lots of taking of rent, in particular from hydrocarbons, and a lot of spreading the love around. So the regime and the figures have made themselves unbelievably wealthy on the back of oil and gas exports. And that was the same in Ukraine. So money, oil and gas comes in and it goes out, and people are taking rent all the way down the system. So whether it's taking people from digging things out of the ground and transporting it, refining it, to shipping it abroad, there's money to be made along the way. And I think Putin's made colossal amounts of money. If you look at some of the figures quoted versus the wealth of some of the people in the regime, you only have to imagine how much he's taken himself and squirreled away. And I think when he dies, or in due course, we'll find out just how wealthy he was. And you also see the wealth is not just paper wealth, it's wealth in the way he lives, in his palaces were built for him, or the extreme luxury that these people live in. I think there's the disparity between the extreme wealth and the poverty is broadened under Putin's rule, the gap between rich and poor. I've read one report that it's now bigger than it was under the Tsarist Empire, at the end of the Tsarist Empire, which then begat the communist, the revolutions of 1917. So it's obscene. And you can see that around Moscow, this sort of different life. But I think wealth, money, is the oil in the pump, should we say, of the system. Without money and graft and favours and backhanders, the whole system would break down. It's not done by personal loyalty and love out for Vladimir Putin. I don't think he was an absolute ruler in the first 2 terms. I think he gradually consolidated power, as I said, through use of the war in Chechnya, rubbing out to them like they were in the toilet. I think going after civil society, driving out people who were like Berezovsky. But I think the key moment for me was the arrest of Kleptocracy in 2003, because he was one of the wealthiest men in Russia. He had, should we say, breached the agreement not to get involved in politics. So you can make lots of money, but don't get involved in politics. And I think Kleptocracy, 1 and 02 was funding Open Russia forums and talking about a more democratic capitalist, market economy. And that got in the way of the direction that Putin wants to take Russia, which was more into the hands of the strong state, strong centre, and dirigism. So that his arrest and imprisonment sent a message clearly to all the other business interests of Russia that there was a new man in town. And I think from that, then that helped the consolidation of power in his hands, which led him started to make, become more in a sort of area of geopolitics. So he was already involved in Ukraine in 2004. He was saying that Ukraine is not independent power by 7 or 8. He came out and then started a war in Georgia in 2008 as well. So, but I think it goes back to, if he hadn't consolidated power in the early 2000s, he wouldn't have been able to do those things. Well, apparently, when the family, quote unquote, were looking for a successor, one, he had to be reliable, sensible, sober, and they also had to give him something to do. He had to prove himself. So there's a period between becoming prime minister in 1999 and then becoming chosen, and Yeltsin just deciding on top of, over the heads of Russian people that he would be a successor, that they had to give Putin something. And I think the Chechen war was that opportunity. Now, I don't necessarily believe all the conspiracy stories about blowing up Moscow apartment blocks or whatever, although it does sound pretty suspicious, and it's the sort of thing the KGB and the FSB would do. But certainly, for whatever reason, whether it's foul or coincidence, he used that to consolidate power. It also enabled him to contrast himself with Yeltsin. That Yeltsin had to deal with the Chechens. Putin dealt with the Chechens and finished them off once and for all through extreme brutality. And again, if you look at how he behaved then, you can see a line from how he dealt with the Chechens through to how he's approached the war in Ukraine with exemplary violence, lack of mercy. There is no plan. I mean, I think people say, well, who comes next? And we can all play fantasy, football managers, who's going to be next? And then normal names are rolled out by people who haven't been to Russia. Shoigu's going to do it. Well, Bortnikov, he's dying. Patrushev, Medvedev, I think would like to be in it. I think the point for people to understand is that if the Tsar or Putin, the president, appoints a successor, a Dauphin, then immediately his own power, Putin's, is weakened, because all power goes to the successor. The same happened to Yeltsin, to Putin. So I think Putin looked in 2020 when I got there, he sacked Medvedev, and I think he was looking around for somebody who could take the reins. He'd been in power for 20 years. He was bored with it all, but he couldn't find somebody. So we had this sort of period of, is he going to become president for life, sort of super daddy of the Russian state, like doing Nazarbayev, who'd done in Kazakhstan? Or is he going to be just going to move off and go and count his gold in Switzerland or something on his boat? But he couldn't find somebody who would do to him what he did to Yeltsin and be loyal. And that's why he changed the constitution to be able to have reset the clock, have more terms. So at the moment, he's up to 2036. And then he'll be in his 80s, 83, 84, in 10 years' time. But nobody should expect him to be going, because I don't think he can leave power now. He's a prisoner of the system he's created. And I think the other people who in the system want him in place because he's the one who manages all the various competing sources of power. quite ably and knows how to do that. But him being replaced brings instability. So he's going to die. I think, as I said before, I think he's going to die in harness. He's becoming the Robert Mugabe of Russia. Each year he gets older and older and older. He becomes more stale, more detached from the man he used to be, more surrounded by aging sycophants. The more he's driving Russia into the ground, with no plan. And when he goes, I think it probably leads to a period of instability, which is normally what happens in Russia when there's no clear succession path. Well, because he's only in his role as president, and he's been confronted by this horrendous disaster, which all these 80 sailors died. But I think he was illustrative how he dealt with the families at the time as complete disregard. Just like, didn't want to be involved. I think the lesson he took away from that was never to be exposed like that again. Everything he's done since then has been stage managed. So whether it's the election campaigns, it's all, he's kept off stage. He never meets real people unless it's completely stage managed. He's never entered in a free debate with a political opponent. He saw, I think, the weakness of the Russian system, but rather than trying to sort out the Russian system, he blamed the people for embarrassing him in front of the families. So that's why the commander of the Northern Fleet was removed, not because of the death of the submariners. Putin doesn't care. It was about how it dented his reputation. If you look at it, the Moskva was sunk in 2022 by the Ukrainians, the cruiser off the coast in the Black Sea. And we wrote at the time that Putin had learned his lesson from the Kursk disaster, and not to be repeated. So the sailors' losses was covered up. The families weren't informed. He made no comment of it, and our whole idea was just basically nothing to see here. Let's move on, because he learned that he can never be exposed like that again. There's a famous Russian general said that the chief of general staff, Gerasimov, has to be a good courtier to the Tsar, and he has to be a good general to his soldiers. What's happened over time is that Gerasimov has ceased to be a good general to his soldiers. He's become part of sort of trusted in a club. And to his credit, Gerasimov, I'd say that he did, having planned terribly the invasion, having fallen under the spell of the FSB, who said it would be, Federal Security Service said it would be a rollover, easy peasy. After the chaos of 2022, he did regain some semblance of control by the end into 2023. And then since then, it's been very Gerasimov-y, plodding, throwing people at the problem, but he's not a very imaginative character. I think the problem is that he's now retained purely for his loyalty to Putin, not for his competence. The problem with Putin, of course, is if he gets rid of Gerasimov, he then exposes himself to criticism that he was the one who kept Gerasimov on. It was his decision. So it's easy to keep somebody like, a human shield like Gerasimov and Shoigu, as was, to stop the blame coming to himself. So there's a political reason he keeps Gerasimov in position, even though the military know Gerasimov's incompetent, that the soldiers in particular know it, all the military bloggers and the whole Russia thinks that the guy's a joke, but he's not there for his military expertise anymore. He's there as a courtier. It's been a whole process over the last, 26 years of optimism bias in the West. What was the process. So Yeltsin would do things like rig the election or collapse or drink himself into coma. And we went, oh, no, it's just Boris being Boris, as Clinton said. But the warning signs were there, that the old system had never gone away. They just mutated into the new system. The apparatchiks who'd succeeded in the Soviet Union now become the new managers in the new Russia. Same in Ukraine happened as well. Lots of Komsomol types sort of emerged back through the youth movement and just moved into positions of power in new Ukraine. So I think through the 90s, then Putin and the war on terror, there was optimism that basically Putin's on our side, somebody we could work with. But we didn't really sit down and think, hold on here, he's arrested Khodorkovsky, he's clamped down on civil liberties, he's tried to interfere in the election in Ukraine by poisoning Yushchenko, he's invaded Georgia, he's killed and murdered Litvinenko. The tone is incredibly aggressive. I was in Ukraine in 2008. David Miliband, the previous Foreign Secretary, and who knows, the future Foreign Secretary, came. He said, "This must be a turning point. Turning point for Europe. A wake-up call for Europe." And we just slept on. That's 2008. And there were another 6 years to the annexation of Crimea. And then we tried to parlay it all. Why can't the two sides just sit down and, just work it all out in this sort of ridiculous Minsk process? And then we had this sort of dirty war, and hundreds being killed, which I see their faces in Kiev when you visit there. And then lead up to the full-blown invasion. So I think there was such relief in 1991 that the Cold War was over, that we're willing to give a hall pass or turn a blind eye to Putin and bad behaviour. It's just Russians being Russians. And he clamped down on Russians. He became increasingly aggressive against the West, and that all led to the invasion and what's happened since. Finally, even after the Salisbury poisonings, still French and Germans can't be beasties to the Russians, John. We still maintain diplomatic relations. Anyway, it's just the Russians killing each other. Well, no, I think it was a sign, a whole series of signs, and finally, 2022, people realise what they're up against. So it took a long time. I'm glad we are where we are. I'm glad that NATO and the European Union broadly stuck together pretty well. We've supported Ukraine in their fight. That Ukraine hasn't folded, and I think in terms of the press, I think it's good that in the media in the UK in particular, that there's been a good effort to try and highlight what Russia's like to us as Britain's, the threat it represents. And the more we can do that, understand how Russia really is, not sort of this sort of glib Putin cornered by rats, that sort of stuff. Helps. So we've disinvested in our understanding of Russia for 30 years, and we need to reinvest in it. And whether that's in the government or that's also in the media and in the public. Sure, acts of measures have been going on since the 1920s. And I think when Stalin said, abandon revolution in the world and said it'd be revolution in one country, in Russia, it was because he realised that Russia was weak against the West. So unable to have a direct confrontation, it was a indirect confrontation, which has really been going on since the 1920s. Now it comes and goes, whether it's we had brief periods of alliance during the Second World War, but fundamentally there's been a confrontation with the Soviet Union, now Russia, since about 1926. And that sort of manifests itself in obviously the espionage we knew, Cambridge 5 and all that, bribery and corruption, assassination, influence peddling, disinformation, misinformation, the Zinoviev letter, all these sort of used tools to try and divide us, to weaken the enemy indirectly, to make us disheartened, to stop supporting Ukraine, to abandon our nuclear deterrent, like CND. And I think what that means is that the means of that confrontation have changed. So now we have the internet and we have cyber warfare, whatever. But the intent is the same, is to undermine us from inside. I'm glad, I think, that the recognition of that has grown over recent years, especially since the beginning of the war in 2022. But there's a lot more we should be doing to build our resilience, to deter Russia by denying them the space to operate inside the United Kingdom and the West. I think I have two different types of army, and I think both armies reflect the societies from which they're drawn. So the British Army is different from the Russian Army. The British Army is different from the French Army for a reason, because armies come from the society which the soldiers come from. I think in Ukraine, you've always had a weak state and a strong civil society. And in Russia, you have a strong state and a weak civil society. So you have two different types of model, shall we say. You also have, Ukraine's a democratic country. It's had free and fair elections. It's had relatively peaceful transfers of power, apart from in 2014. Russia hasn't. So you have this sort of strong centralising, top-down authoritarian model in Russia, and you have a bottom-up civil society, innovative, where people in Ukraine succeed despite the state rather than because of it. That the state is seen as weak, inefficient, incompetent. But because of the history of Ukraine, people just get on with things. And I think it's reflected in what we've seen in the last 4 years, that you have sort of a bottom-up army in Ukraine, small brigades, people recruiting or fundraising themselves, highly innovative, but quite localized. So one brigade doesn't talk to another brigade, doesn't talk to another brigade. And now the Ukrainians are trying to bring some order to that. In the Russian system, you have no innovation at the bottom levels. It's all very top down, which means that Russia can, when it decides to do something, can implement it at scale. But it's not as inventive and imaginative as the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians have had problems with scaling up. Russia can scale up, but weaker solutions. So I think what you're seeing is sort of two different types of armies fighting out. Now, obviously, it goes back and forth. Russia copies Ukraine, Ukraine copies Russia. So there's always that part of it. But I think fundamentally, Ukraine, as former President Kuchma said, Ukraine is not Russia. It also shows the lie of Putin's myth, assertion that basically Ukraine is a lost province and Russians desperate to come home. Yeah, I'm on tipping points. The problem is there's too many experts or talking heads claim to identify tipping points all the time. When actually, if you step back, the position on the ground hasn't really changed since 2023. Russia has made advances over the last couple of years. Ukraine makes some successes here. Russia's still pushing forward in the Donbass, maybe seeing some local successes. Ukraine is starting to interdict Russian logistics into Crimea and to put grit in the oyster of resupply. But then Russia's also has escalated against the cities. Ukrainians are targeting Russian oil refineries and bringing the war home to Russians, ordinary Russians. So I don't think Ukraine's out of the woods, because the factors are, one, Russia's still bigger than Ukraine and richer and more people. Two, Ukraine has some significant problems of its own to sort out internally, especially manpower and money. The position of the Americans is, should I say, uncertain. Under Donald Trump, we've gone through different iterations, and he seems to be slightly on a more positive pro-Ukrainian note at the moment, but that may not last. And Europe, until recently, has been back and forth. So I hope that Ukraine retains and continues to expand initiative. But the question is whether what Ukraine is doing will drive Putin to change his position. And I don't see any sign of that. So I think the bet on both sides is that the war is going to continue. It's now one of survival. Who can last the longest?